Right now, at this exact moment, Iranian hypersonic missiles are streaking toward Riyadh at speeds exceeding 13,000 kilometers per hour. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense confirms at least 3 missiles were launched from positions inside Iranian territory, targeting the Saudi capital's government district. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps posted a statement on social media claiming responsibility, while Saudi air defense batteries scramble to intercept what Tehran calls precision retaliation. This is the first direct Iranian ballistic missile attack on Saudi Arabian sovereign territory in the modern era, crossing a threshold that has defined regional restraint for decades. One side launched missiles at a capital city housing millions of civilians. The other side claims those missiles are now being destroyed mid-flight. In the next 20 minutes, we'll know whether Riyadh's skyline remains intact or whether the Middle East just witnessed the opening salvo of the war everyone feared was coming. Let me walk you through exactly what happened in the last 90 minutes. At 0847 hours local time on Wednesday, March 4th, 2026, Israeli satellite tracking systems detected multiple thermal signatures consistent with ballistic missile launches originating from the Shahid Bagheri missile base located approximately 40 kilometers southwest of Isfahan, Iran. According to Reuters, confirmed by AFP and reported by Al Arabiya, at least 3 missiles, identified preliminarily as Fatah-1 hypersonic systems, were launched in rapid succession with flight trajectories calculated to terminate in central Riyadh. The Fatah-1 represents Iran's most advanced missile technology, entering service in mid-2023 with claimed hypersonic glide vehicle capabilities enabling terminal phase maneuvering that complicates interception. At 0852 hours, the Saudi Royal Air Defense Forces activated emergency protocols, with multiple Patriot PSE-3 batteries and THAAD interceptor systems across Riyadh going to full alert status. Saudi state television interrupted regular programming at 0855 hours with urgent bulletins instructing Riyadh residents to seek shelter immediately. Social media platforms exploded with video footage from Riyadh showing sonic booms and contrails visible in the morning sky, though independent verification of these videos remains ongoing. At 0903 hours, Iran's IRGC Aerospace Force commander, Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, released a statement through the Tasnim news agency declaring that Iran had conducted precision strikes against Zionist Saudi joint intelligence facilities in response to what Iran claims was a joint Israeli-Saudi operation that assassinated senior IRGC Quds Force commander General Hassan Irlou in Damascus 48 hours earlier. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense issued its own statement at 0911 hours, categorically denying any involvement in the Damascus operation while confirming that Saudi air defenses were engaging multiple incoming threats over Riyadh. As I record this, at approximately 0920 hours, Saudi authorities have not confirmed successful interceptions, nor have they reported impacts within the city. The information blackout from official sources suggests either successful interception with debris management underway or catastrophic impact with casualty assessment still being conducted before public announcement. To understand the significance of what we're watching unfold, you need to understand what the Fatah-1 hypersonic missile actually represents in terms of capability and what it means for regional security architecture. The Fatah-1 is not Iran's standard Shahab or Sejil ballistic missile that follows predictable parabolic trajectories. This is Iran's first operational hypersonic glide vehicle system, unveiled in June 2023, representing a generational leap in Iranian missile technology that fundamentally alters regional power calculations. The system consists of a 2-stage solid-fuel rocket booster that propels the hypersonic glide vehicle to altitudes exceeding 100 kilometers before the glide vehicle separates and begins its terminal approach. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow physics-determined arcs after boost phase ends, the Fatah-1's glide vehicle possesses aerodynamic control surfaces enabling lateral maneuvering during its descent phase. Iran claims the missile achieves speeds exceeding Mach 13 during terminal approach with the ability to perform evasive maneuvers up to 20 degrees off its original trajectory. Here's why that matters strategically. Saudi Arabia's layered air defense architecture relies primarily on American-supplied systems. Patriot PAC-3 batteries for terminal phase interception, THAAD systems for exo-atmospheric engagement, and older PAC-2 systems for lower-tier defense. These systems were designed to intercept ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories where interception geometry can be calculated from launch detection through impact. Hypersonic glide vehicles operating at Mach 13 plus speeds, with terminal maneuvering capability compress decision timelines to seconds, while introducing trajectory uncertainty that degrades intercept probability. The Patriot PAC-3's kill vehicle must execute a direct body-to-body collision traveling at closing speeds potentially exceeding Mach 20. If the target performs even modest lateral maneuvers in the final seconds before impact, the intercept window collapses. According to Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, hypersonic glide vehicles represent the most significant advancement in missile technology since the invention of the ICBM because they combine the speed of ballistic missiles with the unpredictability of cruise missiles while operating in a flight regime where most defensive systems weren't designed to function. The strategic significance extends beyond technical capabilities to deterrence psychology. For decades, Saudi Arabia relied on American security guarantees and American-supplied defensive systems to offset Iranian missile superiority. Iran possessed thousands of ballistic missiles capable of striking Saudi territory, but Saudi defenses demonstrated reasonable intercept probability against Shahab-3 and Sejil-2 systems during previous exchanges involving Houthi forces in Yemen firing Iranian-supplied missiles at Saudi cities. Those intercepts, while not perfect, were successful enough to maintain Saudi confidence that Iranian missile threats remained manageable. The Fatah 1 shatters that confidence. If these missiles successfully penetrate Saudi defenses and strike targets in Riyadh with precision, and that remains a massive if at this moment, then Saudi Arabia confronts the reality that Iran can hold its capital city at risk with conventional precision strikes that Saudi defenses cannot reliably stop. That psychological shift transforms regional deterrence dynamics. Saudi Arabia would face a choice: accept vulnerability to Iranian missile strikes, massively expand defensive investments in systems specifically designed to counter hypersonic threats, or develop offensive capabilities that threaten Tehran with comparable risk. None of those options are attractive, which is precisely why Iran developed these systems. Asymmetric capability creates leverage even without firing a shot. The fact that Iran is now firing these shots suggests Tehran believes it needs to demonstrate capability rather than merely claim it. Here's the calculation that led to this moment, and here's why understanding the strategic logic is essential even if you find Iranian actions abhorrent. Iran's position in the regional security architecture has deteriorated significantly since the beginning of 2026. The assassination of General Hassan Irlou in Damascus represents the seventh targeted killing of senior IRGC commanders in the past 14 months, according to analysis from the Institute for the Study of War. These eliminations systematically degrade Iran's operational capabilities across its regional proxy network, while demonstrating that Iranian commanders enjoy no sanctuary even in allied territory like Syria. From Iran's perspective, articulated consistently in Supreme Leader Khamenei's speeches and IRGC strategic communications, this systematic targeting campaign represents an existential threat to Iran's regional deterrent architecture. Iran's regional power doesn't rest on its conventional military, which remains technologically inferior to Israel and Gulf Arab states equipped with American systems. Iran's power rests on its missile forces and its network of proxy organizations across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. If adversaries can systematically eliminate the commanders who coordinate this network without suffering meaningful retaliation, then Iran's deterrent collapses. According to Dr. Afshan Ostovar, Associate Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School and author of Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards, Iran faces what strategists call a use it or lose it dilemma with its missile capabilities. If Iran never demonstrates willingness to employ its missiles against high-value targets in response to severe provocations, then adversaries conclude those missiles serve purely symbolic purposes and can be discounted in strategic calculations. But if Iran fires missiles and they're successfully intercepted without inflicting damage, then Iran demonstrates weakness rather than strength. This creates the logic for today's strikes. Iran needed to demonstrate that its missiles can reach and strike targets in Saudi Arabia, and by extension anywhere in the Gulf, while employing its most advanced systems to maximize probability of penetrating defenses. The choice of Riyadh as target serves multiple strategic purposes. First, it's a higher value target than oil infrastructure or military bases, creating maximum psychological impact. Second, it signals that Iran holds Gulf capitals at risk, not merely peripheral assets. Third, it attempts to drive a wedge between Saudi Arabia and Israel by demonstrating that Saudi support for or tolerance of Israeli operations against Iran carries direct costs to Saudi security. The Iranian calculation appears to be that Saudi Arabia, despite substantial investments in air defense, cannot reliably protect its capital against Iran's most advanced missiles, and that this demonstration will force Saudi recalculation of its alignment with Israeli and American pressure on Iran. Now let's examine Saudi Arabia's position. According to analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, Saudi Arabia has invested approximately $15 billion in air defense systems over the past decade, creating one of the most sophisticated defensive networks in the developing world. Yet Saudi Arabia faces a fundamental problem: geographic vulnerability. Riyadh sits approximately 1,200 kilometers from Iranian launch sites, placing it well within range of Iranian missile systems, with flight times under 10 minutes from launch to impact. That compressed timeline leaves minimal room for decision-making and defensive response. Saudi Arabia depends absolutely on early warning from American satellite systems and radar networks to provide sufficient time for defensive batteries to calculate intercept geometry and launch interceptors. If American intelligence detected these launches immediately and communicated to Saudi air defenses within seconds, Saudi batteries would have perhaps 7 to 8 minutes to detect, track, calculate, and engage. That's theoretically sufficient time for systems like THAAD and Patriot PAC-3, but only if everything functions perfectly and the incoming missiles follow predictable paths. The hypersonic maneuvering capability potentially introduced by Fatah 1 systems compresses that margin to near zero in the terminal phase. From Saudi Arabia's strategic perspective, this attack represents a nightmare scenario regardless of whether interceptions succeed. If Saudi defenses successfully intercept all incoming missiles, Iran still demonstrated willingness to fire directly at the Saudi capital, forcing Saudi Arabia to acknowledge it exists under permanent threat, requiring constant defensive readiness and American support. If even one missile penetrates defenses and strikes a significant target in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia's vulnerability is exposed to its population, regional rivals, and global markets. Either outcome undermines Saudi Arabia's regional leadership position and creates massive domestic political pressure on Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to respond forcefully, potentially escalating beyond his preferred limits. According to Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former U.S. ambassador to the UAE and current senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Saudi Arabia's leadership has spent the past 3 years attempting to de-escalate tensions with Iran, pursuing diplomatic engagement while rebuilding relationships strained by Yemen war and regional competition. The restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in March 2023, brokered by China, represented a significant strategic shift, where Riyadh attempted to reduce security threats through diplomatic normalization rather than military confrontation. Today's attack shatters that diplomatic framework, potentially forcing Saudi Arabia back into confrontational posture it had been trying to escape. There are 3 scenarios for how the next 72 hours unfold, and I'm going to walk you through each with probability assessments based on historical precedent and current strategic positions. Scenario 1 is successful interception with diplomatic de-escalation, which I assess at approximately 35% probability. In this scenario, Saudi air defenses successfully intercept all incoming Iranian missiles with no impacts in Riyadh. Debris falls in unpopulated areas, causing minimal damage. Saudi Arabia documents the attack through radar tracks, satellite imagery, and interceptor telemetry, presenting comprehensive evidence of Iranian aggression to international community. Iran claims the strikes were successful, but presents no evidence of impacts, allowing both sides to maintain face-saving positions. The United States, European Union, and Gulf Cooperation Council issue strong condemnations of Iranian action while stopping short of military response. Diplomatic backchannels activate through Omani mediation, with Iran privately signaling that the strike represented one-time retaliation for the Damascus assassination rather than opening move in broader campaign. Saudi Arabia publicly declares that its defenses performed successfully and that any repeat attack will trigger devastating retaliation, but privately accepts that pursuing military escalation serves no strategic interest. Within 72 hours, both sides step back from the brink through tacit understanding that further escalation benefits neither party. This scenario requires several conditions to materialize. First, interceptions must be genuinely successful, with no missile impacts causing casualties or significant damage. If even one missile strikes a government building or residential area with casualties. Domestic political pressure in Saudi Arabia makes restraint nearly impossible. Second, the United States must provide diplomatic cover for Saudi restraint by offering enhanced defensive capabilities and intelligence sharing, allowing the Saudi leadership to claim victory through defensive success rather than offensive retaliation. Third, Iran must signal privately that this represented bounded retaliation rather than opening escalation, giving Saudi Arabia confidence that restraint won't invite further attacks. Historical precedent suggests this scenario is plausible but not highly probable. During the 2019 attack on Saudi Aramco facilities at Ab Qaik, where Iranian drones and cruise missiles successfully struck critical infrastructure, Saudi Arabia chose not to retaliate militarily despite clear Iranian responsibility. That restraint occurred because Saudi leadership calculated that military response would trigger broader conflict that Saudi Arabia couldn't win without full American participation, and the Trump administration declined to provide that support. Similar dynamics might apply here. However, the 2019 attack targeted oil infrastructure, not the capital city. Attacks on capitals carry different psychological weight and create different political imperatives, which is why I assess this scenario at only 35% despite rational incentives for de-escalation. Scenario 2 is limited impact with controlled retaliation, assessed at 40% probability. In this scenario, 1 or possibly 2 Iranian missiles penetrate Saudi defenses and impact targets in Riyadh. The strikes hit either government facilities or commercial areas rather than residential neighborhoods, causing limited casualties, perhaps 5 to 20 deaths, with 50 to 100 injured. Iran presents video evidence of impacts, claiming successful demonstration of capability while emphasizing that strikes targeted military intelligence infrastructure rather than civilian populations. Saudi Arabia confirms impacts while minimizing casualty figures publicly, but faces massive domestic pressure for retaliation from both royal family hardliners and nationalist sentiment among the population. Within 24 to 48 hours, Saudi Arabia conducts limited retaliatory strikes against Iranian targets, most likely targeting IRGC facilities, missile production sites, or proxy infrastructure in Iraq or Syria, rather than striking deep inside Iranian territory. These strikes employ cruise missiles or drones launched from Saudi territory, or potentially from U.S. platforms if Washington agrees to provide targeting support. The retaliation is carefully calibrated to demonstrate Saudi willingness to respond while avoiding escalation that would trigger full-scale Iranian counterattack. Iran conducts symbolic counter-retaliation, perhaps strikes on Saudi military bases in the eastern province, or attacks on Saudi-bound shipping in the Persian Gulf conducted by IRGC naval forces, sufficient to demonstrate that Iranian deterrent remains intact, but stopping short of triggering Saudi counter-counter retaliation. Over the course of 72 to 96 hours, this controlled escalation sequence plays out with both sides demonstrating resolve, while deliberately constraining their actions to avoid crossing tripwires that would lock them into spiral they cannot control. The United States plays critical role as crisis manager, using intelligence sharing and diplomatic pressure to ensure both sides understand each other's red lines and intentions, reducing risk of miscalculation. This scenario has reasonable probability because it allows both sides to achieve minimum essential objectives. Iran demonstrates missile capability and willingness to strike high-value targets. Saudi Arabia demonstrates that attacks on its capital trigger painful retaliation, but neither side pursues maximalist objectives that would require decisive military victory. The key variable is whether casualties from initial Iranian strikes remain low enough that Saudi political leadership can frame limited retaliation as proportionate rather than appearing weak in the face of aggression. According to analysis from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, controlled escalation sequences have become increasingly common in Middle East conflicts as regional powers recognize that full-scale war serves no party's interests. We saw this pattern in Israeli-Iranian exchanges in 2024, in U.S.-Iran confrontations in 2020, and in various Saudi-Houthi engagements. The pattern works when both sides possess sufficient command and control to ensure that tactical commanders don't exceed strategic guidance, and when both sides maintain functioning diplomatic backchannels that enable signaling of intent. Those conditions might exist here, which is why I assess this as the most probable scenario. Scenario 3 is catastrophic escalation leading to regional war, which I assess at 25% probability. In this scenario, multiple Iranian missiles penetrate Saudi defenses and strike high-value targets in Riyadh, including government buildings, potentially the royal palace compound, or critical infrastructure. Casualties exceed 100 killed with several hundred wounded. Iran celebrates the strikes as demonstration of its capabilities, while Saudi Arabia faces national humiliation and overwhelming pressure for massive retaliation. Within 12 to 24 hours, Saudi Arabia launches extensive air campaign against Iranian missile sites, IRGC facilities, and potentially nuclear infrastructure, coordinated with Israeli forces who seize opportunity to strike Iranian nuclear program. The United States provides intelligence support and potentially participates directly if American citizens are killed in the Riyadh strikes. Iran responds with full-scale missile and drone campaign targeting Saudi oil infrastructure, U.S. military bases across the Gulf, Israeli cities, and potentially closing or mining the Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global oil supplies transit. Iranian proxy forces activate across the region, with Hezbollah launching rocket campaigns against Israel from Lebanon, Iraqi militias striking U.S. forces in Iraq, and Houthi forces in Yemen intensifying attacks on Saudi territory and Red Sea shipping. Within 48 to 72 hours, the region descends into multi-front conflict involving Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, and various proxy forces. Oil prices spike above $120 per barrel as markets price and supply disruption risk. Global powers attempt crisis mediation, but find that events have outpaced diplomacy, with military operations creating facts on the ground that constrain diplomatic options. This nightmare scenario remains the least probable of the three, but cannot be dismissed because it represents how relatively contained initial exchanges can spiral through miscalculation, domestic political pressure, and the logic of preemption. If Saudi Arabia concludes that Iran's demonstrated capability to strike Riyadh with limited warning means that future Iranian attacks are inevitable, then Saudi Arabia faces incentive to strike Iranian missile capabilities now before Iran can conduct follow-on attacks. If Iran concludes that Saudi retaliation will target its missile forces and potentially its nuclear program, then Iran faces incentive to use those capabilities immediately before losing them to preemptive strikes. This creates the classic security dilemma, where each side's defensive preparations appear offensive to the other side, driving spiral dynamics. According to Professor Kenneth Waltz's analysis in The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, regional conflicts between near-peer competitors lacking stable deterrence frameworks are most vulnerable to catastrophic escalation when one or both sides believe they face use-it-or-lose-it choices with major capabilities. We might be approaching that threshold today. The probability remains relatively low because both Saudi Arabia and Iran have strong incentives to avoid full-scale war they would both lose. But that doesn't mean rational incentives will prevail when domestic politics, organizational pressures, and crisis fog create momentum toward escalation. Here's what you need to watch in the next 24 to 72 hours to determine which scenario is materializing. First, casualty reports from Riyadh. If Saudi Arabia confirms that air defenses successfully intercepted all missiles with no impacts or only debris damage, that supports Scenario 1. If Saudi Arabia confirms limited impacts with casualties under 50, that supports Scenario 2. If casualties exceed 100, or if strikes hit symbolically significant targets like the Royal Palace or major government buildings, Scenario 3 probability increases dramatically. Saudi Arabia has powerful incentive to minimize reported casualties for both security and political reasons, so if official figures acknowledge significant casualties, actual damage is likely worse than reported. Second, American military movements. Monitor U.S. Central Command announcements and ship tracking data for Fifth Fleet assets. If the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, currently in the Arabian Sea, moves into the Persian Gulf itself, or if additional carrier strike groups receive deployment orders, that signals American preparation for major military operations in support of Saudi Arabia. If U.S. forces maintain current posture without significant redeployment, that suggests diplomatic management remains the primary American approach. Track also whether B-2 stealth bombers deploy to Diego Garcia or whether additional fighter squadrons deploy to Saudi bases. These force movements provide minimum 24 to 48-hour warning before major American military operations could commence. Third, Iranian domestic messaging. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's public statements carry enormous weight in signaling Iranian intentions. If Khamenei makes a major speech within 48 hours, his language will reveal whether Iran seeks off-ramp or further confrontation. Phrases emphasizing resistance and retaliation for aggression suggest Iran is framing the strike as defensive response and might accept de-escalation if adversaries don't escalate further. Phrases emphasizing punishment and eliminating threats suggest Iran is preparing domestic audience for sustained campaign. Monitor also IRGC commanders' statements. If senior IRGC figures declare that the Riyadh strike represents first phase of larger operation, escalation probability increases. If IRGC emphasizes that the strike was proportionate response to specific provocation, de-escalation remains possible. Fourth, oil market reactions. Global oil prices serve as real-time probability assessment of conflict escalation. If Brent crude prices remain below $90 per barrel, markets assess escalation risk as manageable. If prices spike above $95 per barrel, markets are pricing in significant supply disruption risk. If prices exceed $110 per barrel, markets believe major conflict is highly probable. Oil markets aggregate information from thousands of traders with access to intelligence, shipping data, and supply chain information, making them reasonably reliable, leading indicators of conflict probability. Fifth, diplomatic activity. Watch for emergency meetings at the United Nations Security Council, statements from European Union foreign ministers, and particularly Chinese diplomatic engagement. China brokered the 2023 Saudi-Iran rapprochement and has strong economic interest in preventing Gulf conflict that would disrupt oil supplies and global trade. If Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi makes emergency trip to Tehran or Riyadh within 48 hours, that signals major Chinese concern and potential mediation effort. If Russia begins evacuating diplomatic personnel from Iran, or if Russian military advisors withdraw from Syrian positions, that indicates Moscow possesses intelligence, suggesting imminent major military operations. Russia often positions itself ahead of Middle East escalations based on its intelligence relationships with Iran and Syria, making Russian movements a useful indicator even when Moscow's public statements remain ambiguous.